Okay, this is a video I've been wanting to make for a while about one of my favorite characters in Final Fantasy, and someone that I think gets overlooked by people. Lieutenant Colonel Yaag Rosch, and how I think he could function within Dissidia Final Fantasy. Now, of course, quick warning, this will contain spoilers for both Final Fantasy XIII and the entire Dissidia series. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping first. I will be dividing this video into chapters, so if you already know a lot of the basic information about Final Fantasy XIII or Dissidia, you can use those below. Now, first of all, I just want to briefly touch on what Dissidia is, because while it was fairly popular among Final Fantasy fans, it also sort of flew under the radar, due to being an arena fighter that at first was bound to the PSP, the less fortunate rival to the Nintendo DS, and then when it got released onto more popular consoles, it was a team-based arena fighter, which lacked a lot of single-player content, and that kind of killed it for a lot of people. And then there was Opera Omnia, a turn-based mobile phone gacha game that is no longer accessible, unfortunately. Now, for Yaag Rosch himself, I'm going to be honest with you guys. Yaag is a very minor character in 13. Not to mention, 13 was, at one point in time, the most divisive game in the franchise. Opera Omnia never even touched him before end of service. So, it's fair to ask, why would I want a literally who, from a game a lot of people did at the time and some still consider to be a low point in the series? Well, I think it's because he brings something very unique to the table for the cast of the franchise. In that, he's a human. He is a stock standard human, at least as far as Final Fantasy's schizophrenic power scaling is concerned. He doesn't have some cool sword or magic, but what he does have is really cool sci-fi technology and a very ruthless but tactical mind. But then comes the other question. He's the lieutenant colonel, the next in line. Why not SciComm's commander-in-chief, the military he works for? Why not his boss? Well, to start off with, I just kind of don't like Jill as a character, just for honesty's sake, but Jill and Yaag, I feel like, represent very different things. And what Jill represents makes more sense. Sure, it got her into Opera Omnia, but see, that's because if both of them can be seen as extensions of military power, then Jill is more focused on control. Within the context of 13 and SciComm and Cocoon, Jill is the ideal kind of sociopath needed to keep that kind of huge operation running. But Yaag is a man of the people. The only thing he cares about is the best interest of Cocoon and its citizens, and he even admits so at the very end of the game, when he says that he caused a lot of needless panic and regretted that. But if Yaag isn't much of a fighter, and he's not even the commander of his military, then what is he? Well, The thing about Cocoon is that it is a special forces unit. This is where the top of the line go. And sure, he has that sword at his side that he doesn't really use, and I'm gonna have him use it a little bit, but what we're really looking at for Yaag is I want him to be an interpretation, if not personification, of Cocoon's entire military force. To anyone who's played 13-2, let me put it to you this way. I want Yaag to feel like the entire weight of Cocoon's military is crashing down onto the opponent like it's year one after fall. For anyone who isn't aware, Cocoon is one of the 2 planets that Final Fantasy XIII takes place on, with Cocoon being the more sci-fi orientated location, not only in the game, but probably the most sci-fi setting in the entire franchise. We're not talking about the typical, steampunk Magitech setting that a lot of Final Fantasy games are known for. We're talking about floating cars, advanced computers that can teleport items from floating terminals, flying tanks, laser cannons that can be remote operated with seemingly no known propulsion, and magic having been synthesized as standard military use. In other words, Yaag is entering a battle of swords and sorcery. Not just with his, a gun, like Laguna has, or some, laser-firing computer bits like Golbez. But I want him to embrace the little bit of sci-fi and military fantasy elements the series has known so far. The music I have playing in the background is the Palamecia Assault version of Defiers of Fate from 13. And if the rest of Dissidia's cast are the ethereal hums, hopeful strings, and shredding guitars in that music, I want Yaag to be that heavy, overwhelming synth that flows in and out of the track and breaks into it when it does show up. Now, a quick clarification. Although I will be covering the entire Dissidia series, I'll be doing it a little bit differently. For gameplay, I'll primarily be focusing on Duodecim, as that is the game that most people tend to focus on for the mechanics of Dissidia. That's kind of the game that it's best known for, and also the one that has the most complexity in terms of any given character's kit. New Tale, the console version of Arcade, has its own system that's more simplified, and Opera Omnia is a turn-based game that I will cover separately later. While some things from Duodecim will make it into New Tale, just assume I'm talking about Duodecim unless I clarify otherwise. Now, for the stories of each of these games, because it is a story-based series regardless of what NT likes to tell you, I don't see him having a huge role in any of the 3 arena fighters. But Opera Omnia, the way it was formatted, guarantees that every character gets a chapter focused on them. So when I get to the story stuff, I'll briefly mention my thoughts on how he might work in the other 3, but I'll primarily be focused on Opera Omnia. Just keep all of that in mind as we go forward. Now, For a quick primer on gameplay for Dissidia, and like I said, I'm going to have chapters, so if you already know this, feel free to skip ahead. Dissidia is very unique, and sometimes can feel like a brick wall to learn because of the bravery system. Basically, all attacks come in two types, bravery and HP. Think of it kind of like if in a fighting game you can only deal damage to the opponent's health bar using supers, but instead of a defined meter, you have a point value that dictates how much damage that super will do. You smack Brave to deplete Brave, you smack with an HP attack to deplete HP. Each game also has the EX system, but it works a little bit differently. In the PSP games, it's an EX mode, which is a super form, or a universal super form, while NT and Opera Omnia have X skills, which is a signature ability that you pop and then it goes on cooldown. Now, for Yaag's bravery attacks, I want to remind you that he is a military commander. And the focus on that would be that his bravery attacks would be bringing in the different weapons of his different units. If the idea is for him to embody Cocoon's military, then he borrows heavily from that military. In this sense, this is a fairly similar kit to what Laguna has in Duodecim, where he will borrow weapons from across 8. But in Yaag's case, we're not talking about the fairly modern firearms of 8. We're talking about the crazy sci-fi shit. This will include things like machine guns, sniper rifles, rocket launchers, grenades, that synthesized magic I mentioned earlier, and even that saber he keeps around on him. Making it so that everything he does either creates some huge thing you just kind of have to deal with to create space, or start shredding the opponent's bravery. Now, I'm going to start to talk about his saber because it's the only thing we know for a fact that he has at all times. He would have 2 different saber combos, one on the ground and one in the air. The faster of the two is Stagger, named after Final Fantasy XIII's signature mechanic of the same name, which is just a long, fast chain of very focused strikes that gives him constant forward momentum while in use. The other one is Sanctify, which is named after the signature ability of the Sanctum Templar shown on screen. Not technically a PsyCom unit, but it is the highest level version of a class of PsyCom units known as the Elites. This is a slower, stronger, wider hitting attack, but the two have about the same frame data, or at least they have about the same length of time they last in. So that also means they have somewhat comparable damage, at least before factoring in whatever your build happens to be and how many crits you end up getting from RNG. The probably most common move that people end up using, though, is the Battle Rifle, which is borrowed from Hunter-class enemies, such as the Infiltrator shown on screen. Going back to the Laguna comparisons, this functions about the same as Laguna's own machine gun. You press the button, and a stream of bullets come out, and you can strafe around while you use it. However, to kind of show the difference in skill and position between Yaag and Laguna, Yaag can just tap the button for a quick 3-round burst and not be stuck in a reload animation. Now, if you do more than the 3-round burst, you still have to reload like Laguna does, but you can just kind of choose not to, do the quick tap, and then go on your merry way. One weapon that Yaag will want to use a lot for space control is the bazooka. This is a high priority projectile that fires a missile and just fucking explodes on contact with anything. It's his slowest of his different weapons, but it demands a lot of respect from the opponent if you do use it, and if you need to clear out an area, it's also is a very good weapon for destroying stage elements. Now, for people who aren't aware, Dissidia has a very funny relationship with physics in that it, especially in the PSP games, it seems to view gravity as a gentle recommendation more than anything else. So, it's worth keeping in mind the aerial bravery attacks. Now, I haven't talked about them a lot so far, in that there isn't a great big distinction between the two, but SciComm does have airborne class units, such as the Dragoon shown on screen. And Yaag would borrow their jetpacks while using aerial attacks, which would act as reflections of the previous move mentioned. Here we have MLRS Volley as a sniper rifle that you can strafe around while holding the button release to fire, and Missile Burst, which causes a cluster of missiles to fire out. Think of these as remixed versions of the battle rifle and bazooka, where the bazooka is a single-hit explosive, but here instead we have a multi-hit explosive. Battle rifle is a string of bullets. MLRS Volley is one single, very powerful bullet. Now, that said, because very few characters have a lot of shared things going on between ground and aerial attacks, Yaag kind of follows suit. Generally speaking, his slower but stronger attacks are used on the ground, while the faster, more mobile ones are used in the air. But all of the following moves I will show from now on will be available both on the ground and in the air, so keep that in mind. Now, going back to what I was saying about that synthesized magic from before, those are known in-game as mana drives, which are very commonly used by the melee units in SciComm, the shock troops and epoch classes, such as the Hunter and Enforcer shown on screen. They can be used for all kinds of stuff: healings, curing status ailments, dealing elemental damage, granting buffs or debuffs, the like. In the case of Yaag, he uses them primarily for their buffs, boosting damage, movement speed, attack priority, or defense, but keep in mind that he can only have at one active at a time, and they're only active for a limited amount of time. And because in Duodecim, you have a very limited number of moves you can bring, that means Yaag will have to do a lot of decision-making before going into a match to decide what is the buff I need to bring. Which buff will best help me against this opponent? Or best help me achieve this build? The other one, and a huge form of stage control for him, is Flag Point Strike, where he fires a targeting beacon, shown on screen, and it will just sit wherever it lands. Next time he uses a move, or after a few seconds have passed, missiles will fly in on its location and just lock down that general area. You can also hold circle to increase how far it will be thrown. But In Dissidia Duodecim, there is a mechanic known as link attacks. Basically, if you have a link attack equipped and you input the button during the end leg of the move it's linked to, you get a follow-up. In this case, it's Havoc Cannon, which has him pull out a laser cannon akin to something we'll be showing later, to fire it at the beacon and just blow up that whole fucking sector of the stage. Just big ass fuck you to whatever happens to be there. Now, the real meat and potatoes of this are his HP attacks, the Annihilator class hardware. See, a trend that exists in Dissidia and was started by Lightning in Duodecim, but not really capitalized on until Opera Omnia, is that the different characters from that game will have their most powerful abilities be based off of their Eidolons. Because in 13, at least in the first game, every character had a unique summon that they could bring out when you're controlling them. Now, because Yaag himself isn't a l'Cie, one of the people chosen by the machine gods, he doesn't have an Eidolon. But, remember how I was talking about that really cool sci-fi tech he has? That's where this comes in. The Annihilator class enemy in Final Fantasy XIII are these huge set-piece mechanical bosses that you fight periodically through the game. And I think all of them are mandatory fights, too. This including his own personal boss fight inside Psycom's secret prototype fucking pseudo-mech, the Proudclad, which is the strongest weapon Psycom has developed. It has those detachable remote-controlled cannons I mentioned, fucking automated point defense weapons, missile batteries, and can switch back and forth between a flying mode and a tank-like assault mode that grants it access to its own big fuck-off laser cannon. The first of his HP attacks I'm going to go through is one of the rarer attacks in the series, that being a counter super in Retaliatory Strike. Essentially, 6 of the Proudclad's remote-controlled laser guns will fly up in front of him, and if they're hit, he'll slide back, they'll fly forward around the enemy, and all fire on their location. Technically, you can dodge it if you hit him from really far away, but chances are better than not, if you smack this thing, you're getting the hit. And because it's only a single HP hit, that means that the opponent can't use an assist to burst out of it. To go over the missile batteries I mentioned, we then have Oniric Maelstrom. For the sake of saving on memory, he would still use the remote-controlled lasers for this, even though the Proudclad doesn't do so in Source. In this case, they'll be lined up on either side and just rain down a set of 6 explosives right in front of him, just taking out everything immediately in front of him. And while it is a short-range attack with a long animation, just because of how wide the area of fire is, just the fucking blast zone, this acts as a fairly reliable get-out-of-my-face move. Arguably more so than even his own sword, depending on the matchup. Now, the other Annihilator class hardware boss that he uses in this kit is the Havoc Sky Tank, which is kind of what it sounds like. a flying tank that has like a bunch of rotary blades on it. Now, remember that big cannon that he borrows to shoot the targeting beacon from before? That's the sky cannons. And that is just a big laser cannon. If this weren't a Final Fantasy game, this thing would be leveling buildings, let alone pesky heroes. Now, the other weapon that it has are plasma blasters. Sure, the Havoc cannon is shown on screen right now, as the plasma blasters would also just use the Proud Class laser guns, but the plasma blasters would come down, fire off shots, and then go back up off screen, and you can hold down the button to increase the range of this attack. So if the opponent is trying to run away and play defensively, you can use the plasma blasters to fuck them out of position. The final of the Annihilator class enemies I'm going to talk about is these Manasvin Warmech. This is the game's first battle, first boss, and tutorial, so I feel like I need to bring it up somewhere. The problem is just that because it's a tutorial boss, it doesn't really do anything. However, what I decided would be fitting is if in Duodecim, it was used for Yaag's chase attacks, as ultimately what kicks off the game, what starts Psycom trying to chase down the heroes, is the fight with the Manasvin Warmech. Technically the Purge, but it starts in earnest with the Warmech. For context, in Dissidia, a lot of moves launch the opponent away, but some of them allow you a follow-up attack. This is a chase attack. And you can either do a fast Brave hit or a slower HP hit, and it's a 50-50. So, for Yaag, he will bring out a miniature version of the Manasvin and either rake them with its fucking saw claws, or for the Brave, or for the HP, it will fire off its laser cannon based off of the wave cannon ability from that tutorial sequence. Yaag's X mode is based off of the move that kicks off his second phase during his boss fight, Release Limiters. Now, of course he gets all the standard stuff everyone else does in Duodecim. It grants him the HP regen and the increased critical rate. But the main draw here is that it brings everything up to 11. We're talking more bullets, bigger explosives, longer lasting mana drives, and of course access to his X-Burst, the Proudclad's final biggest move, the Muon Blaster, which is sort of 13's equivalent to how a lot of games handled the Bahamut boss fights, Mega Flare. And to reiterate, in X mode is the Universal Superform or install that is based off of the most important feat that any given character accomplishes. For a lot of the protagonists, this is their ultimate weapon, such as Squall's Leonhardt, Cloud's Ultima weapon, or Titus's Caldebalge, or however the fuck it's pronounced. I don't know how Gaelic works. While this can also take the form of a signature move, such as Ultimecia's Time Crush or Sephiroth's Sin Heartless Angel. Or it will just be a transformation straight up, like Terra, Zidane, and Kuja's Trance. And if you land an HP attack while you are in an X mode, you can press square again to enter the X burst, which is a finishing blow based off of that character's greatest attack. In this case, as I said, it is the Muon Blaster. Just kind of this big fuck-off laser blast, really? So, if effectively what happens is that he will manifest a shrunken down version of the Proudclad's, like, tank mode, charge it up, you get a little mini game while it's charging, because that's what happens for basically every X burst, you get a small little mini game, and then it will fire off the weapon, and everything fades to white as the opponent is atomized. And if you win the match, you get a special little anime, or screen, of him standing there having just blast the opponent to shit. Now, as I said before, NT is a simpler game overall. It doesn't have quite as much going on. Instead, it has a little bit less customization, where here it is, you pick one of 4 HP attacks going into the match. And also, because you have less moves to work with, he won't use his sword anymore. He'll still have it on him, it's part of his character model, but he'll stick with the guns, explosives, and mana drives. For his 4 HP attacks, he'll have the Wave Cannon, Flag Point Strike, Plasma Blasters, and Oniric Maelstrom. The first 3 will work basically the same as in Duodecim, but Oniric Maelstrom will now fire in a ring instead of in front of him, to make it better as a get-off-me move. And then in Opera Omnia, he will have kind of a 2-in-1 kit, where he's now a lot more focused on just doing big AoE stuff, and keeping his enemies buffed with the mana drive. So he's not very good at fighting like one single boss, but he will have a decently good counterattack that he uses if he's hit, and he can help kind of level enemies who go in with their big hits, or who have like a lot of enemies on screen at once. Now, because X modes are changed to X skills, that means removed limiters also changes. And it changes in a somewhat fascinating way, where here it actually works a lot closer to how it does in Source. Instead of just popping the thing and you heal slowly, now it'll do what it originally did. And you will heal up instantly, about half his total HP, and your stuff will get way stronger, but to simulate how the second half of his boss fight has lower defenses, your bravery slowly drains over time. And if your brave broke, and while you can't have your bravery hit 0 from this effect, if it ever does, you get bopped out of this mode. Additionally, in NT, you can press or activate the X skill again to pop Muon Blaster as a giant laser super and then exit release limiters safely. Whoop. Additionally, in Opera Omnia, release limiters is used to have him switch his kits. At the start of a match, he will act as a somewhat splashable support unit with generally good AoE and buffing skills, but when you activate release limiters, he becomes this pretty crazy, like, AoE DPS sub-tank, as his standard Psycom equipment and the Manasfin's Wave Cannon gets replaced with all of the Havoc Sky Tank and Proudclad abilities. The exception to this being his burst, which is always Muon Blaster. So as long as you can keep him from getting Brave Broken, and his burst effect will make it impossible for his team to get Brave Broken for a few turns after he uses that burst, then he's pretty crazy powerhouse. In short, Yaag should feel exhausting to fight against. Remember that he is just a dude. He is a normal person. He doesn't have any of the anime nonsense of his contemporaries, so he has to force them to play his game instead. He needs to force that war of attrition to win. Whittle the opponent down inch by inch, bullet by bullet. And the moment they finally make a mistake, he is taking every single goddamn pixel of their health bar that he can. But when playing against him, it's worth noting that while he does have some scary tools up close and he can use defensively, he doesn't want to have to use them. If any of you have seen Naruto, think of it kind of like Gaara's sand armor. That's not there to give him a powerful defense. That's there as a last-ditch effort to try and get someone to back off. And if Yaag cannot turn around momentum, then he doesn't have a lot of great ways to do it, then he's just kind of screwed. But keep in mind that even a cornered rat can be dangerous. And he will go down swinging. But an opponent that won't get lost in the roar of gunfire and explosives is a death sentence to him. In Opera Omnia, he's a bit of an odd duck to team build with. Like Yaag Rosch, I think that's how his name is pronounced, he emulates playing as a two-stage boss, with the first stage being very utility-focused for mana drive buffs and flag point strike, dealing passive damage, and not taking up a lot of the limited buff and debuff slots that he has, or that any given character can have in Opera Omnia. Once release limiters activates, he loses most of that utility, if not all of it, and he's just going to start blasting. He's going to blow up the entire screen until everything in front of him is dead. So, it's very important to know which half of his kit you want to use at any given point of a mission. As for Yaag's story mode, so before I begin, I just want to look at an aspect of Dissidia's storytelling that I think is a little overlooked. Every character has music attached to them. Hear me out. In Duodecim, every character with a story mode has a unique theme that plays when they travel along the world. In Opera Omnia, they have a song that plays when navigating the map of their chapter, and a battle theme tied to them. Often this is the same track, but not always. In both cases, Yaag's is the main theme of SciComm, which you're now hearing. A militaristic drum march... Oh, I just noticed there's a typo there. A militaristic drum march befitting of both SciComm and himself. Now, Dissidia has kind of strange storytelling, and it's rather notorious in how inconsistent it is. Duodecim likes to have characters behave as if they're towards the beginning or middle of their games because of how each character's story is meant to be a retelling of their game's story, and he claims that everyone is supposed to take place after their character arc, but that's clearly not the case with Noctis and Ramza. And Opera Omnia has an entire world-building element to explain why people just act in whatever way is plot convenient. Because of this, I think it's worth going over the narrative foundations I'm working with here. See, the thing about Yaag is that he is a top-level commander for someone else, be it Jill Nabat or Galanth Daisley, depending on where you are in the game. He is never going to contest screen time with any other villain, but if he is the main villain in that scene, he is going to demand attention and respect. But he's still a person, and his main focus is still on his duty to protect the innocent, and has intense sense of patriotism. Everything he does for Cocoon, even if it means doing things he knows are wrong. Now, in the PSP games, they take place in a series of cycles. In fact, Duodecim is named that because it's the 12th cycle of the war, with the 13th and final cycle being the story of the first Dissidia game. Between cycles, the world resets. Yaag would not have a very pronounced role in these cycles. He would begrudgingly accept his duty being summoned among Chaos's troops, the villains, but his allies would always put him on edge with their more destructive natures. So he wouldn't want to associate with most of them, but the few he would, I think he would be very fiercely loyal towards. People who share in his ideal to create a safe world for the innocent are the main ones that he would attach himself to. For example, he would definitely be helping out Golbez. Golbez's whole thing is that he's this double agent spy to kind of help Cosmos keep things stabilized and eventually win the war. And I think Yaag would help cover for him. I feel like he might also align himself with Emperor Matthias from Final Fantasy II as sort of a narrative stand-in for Galanth Daisley, Cocoon's Primarch and the main antagonist of 13. But if I were to speculate a little bit on previous cycles with a character that was never in the PSP games, I think that the number one character that he would align himself with is Final Fantasy XII's Vayne Carudas Solidor. Both of them are very similar men, in my opinion. Both of them will stop at nothing to create the best world for their nations. But at the same time, they're also equal opposites. Vayne, shown on screen, is a politician and the child of the Emperor, or one of them anyway. He works a very top-down method, while Yaag works bottom-up given his militaristic position and, I'm assuming, rather humble beginnings. And because these are two people who are so closely aligned, but so different in their approaches, I am so curious what an interaction between them would be like within the context of Dissidia. Would they act as a way to balance each other out and give the other one perspective on what it means to create this utopia? Or would this create just this intense feedback loop of the ends justify the means? After the cycle's end, a new war begins between two new gods, Materia and Spiritus. They're largely the same as Cosmos and Chaos, as far as like how rosters in the game is constructed. But instead of a good versus evil debate like fight, this is more of an ideological one. Materia wishes to create a world where violence is no longer necessary, a safe haven for fallen warriors, while Spiritus simply wants to create a sandbox where anyone can act out whatever their violent wishes happen to be. Just let your desires guide you. And that's kind of how both follow-ups to Dissidia ended up working. See, NT takes place in Spiritus's version of the afterlife. At least I think so. I don't remember if this is outright confirmed or not. Like the cycles of old, the fighting never really ends here, but it's honest about it. He just tells you this is the case. It's an honest battleground where they can go around and do whatever they want. And because of that, NT doesn't really have much of a story. Like, there's one there, it's fun, it has a lot of cool moments, but it's nothing compared to Duodecim, and that ruffled a lot of feathers. Playing Duodecim, for example, will give you a basic understanding of every character that isn't horribly butchered like Zidane was, while NT will only give you a very surface-level understanding of them. And unfortunately, Yaag is a kinda complex character at the end of the day. Maybe not as a person, but certainly in terms of his, like, what he represents in the narrative. And NT wouldn't do anything with that? I feel like he would end up the same way a lot of villains do in NT, where he would show up once, have an introduction, a fight, and then a transition scene explaining why he's not relevant anymore. Or, worst case scenario, he ends up like Xenos and Arden and literally nothing. Now, conversely, Opera Omnia takes place in Materia's afterlife, a once peaceful world that has been flooded with monsters due to the tampering by Spiritus. Because the main thing about these gods is they both keep fucking with each other and messing with the other one's afterlife. There are no good guys in this situation. Now, Opera Omnia was initially launched as a companion app for NT. This was the intended single-player mode for the game, where every character has their own time in the spotlight, and you can pick any 3 characters from across the franchise to build your all-star team with. And this is where I think Yaag would be able to tell his story. Lost Chapter, Aftermath of the Purge. At first, this chapter would have no real signs of Yaag. Just a few of the heroes from 13 wandering around their world. However, they would be immediately ambushed by the Proudclad, that big flying boss I mentioned before. And when they defeat it, they would get into a fight with its pilot, Yaag. However, neither would use release limiters, interestingly enough, meaning that this fight against Yaag will just be his main kit, not his boosted one. While throughout 13, he actively fought against the l'Cie and tried to get those heroes killed, here he's only testing them, see if they've regain their memories of the world. Like I said, Opera Omnia has a whole-ass world-building mechanic explaining why people act the way they do. It's because they get their memory stripped from them when they enter the world. And when he realizes that people fully remember them, he apologizes for the ambush and joins the team. Or at least offers his assistance. Now, Yaag would spend a lot of the chapter reflecting upon his actions in 13 and learning what had become of PSICOM in the sequel. And he isn't really sure how to feel about it, as he doesn't necessarily regret attacking the people. He was only trying to keep the citizens safe. But he also understands that he incited a mass panic and got a lot of his men needlessly killed. That while he was doing what he felt was necessary, he caused a lot of damage that didn't need to happen, a lot of very avoidable destruction. And while some of the heroes, especially Snow and Lightning, do not trust him at all, they think that this is just some game he's playing, Hope and Noel would believe that he had his noble intentions and try to help him. Now, the thing about Jill is that she was one of the last characters added to Opera Omnia before end of service, and I think they would have met up in this chapter. Remember how I said they represent different things way back in the beginning of the video? Well, Jill would confront Yaag over this change of heart, and the two would end up having a philosophical debate over this, over what the role of a nation's military is. And because their beliefs are so incompatible with each other, this would lead to a boss fight, as Yaag really wants PSICOM to fulfill this role of being the necessary protectorate a citizenry needs, while Jill just sees it as a tool to subjugate everyone beneath her. Between talks with his former enemies, his confrontation with his boss, and the words of those from another world, Yaag makes a difficult decision. While he regrets sentencing countless people to their deaths for gods that were negligent at best, it wasn't the Purge that was the problem. It was that he wasn't willing to understand who the l'Cie were and what they were fighting for until it was too late. This would create a scene mirroring the freak out that the heroes in 13 have before their Eidolon appears. You see, in 13, an Eidolon appears before the l'Cie when it looks like they are about to lose their way. A manifestation of their struggles come forth to test their resolve. And here, the Proud Clad would, just like in gameplay, reflect this role of Yaag's pseudo-Eidolon, coming to test that new resolve of his. Now, not only does this end up being a very powerful moment where Yaag comes in full alignment with the l'Cie and comes to an understanding of who they were and what they were fighting for, but this brings everything I've mentioned about him and the way he mirrors them full circle. And as the Proud Clad stands there, ready to gun him down for seemingly becoming a traitor to Cocoon and siding with Pulse scum, he looks that machine he piloted dead in the eyes, or at least its face-like front plating, and he tells us, "Never again shall I allow a single hair of the innocent to be harmed, so long as I draw breath. If I am to die, so be it." And in this true final battle of his lost chapter, the Proud Clad behaves exactly as it did in 13. laser barrages as a targeted strike, Oniric Maelstrom as this party-wide HP attack. If it's Brave broken, it will even counter with Retaliatory Strike every time it attacks, mirroring how the move functions when the Proudclad is staggered, meaning that if you get this thing at its weakest point, it starts racking up damage crazy fast. And the moment its health hits halfway, it heals back up to full with release limiters, gaining all the same buffs and debuffs as Yaag, and starts counting down to its Muon Blaster. And if that timer hits 0, your party tank is the only one that has any chance of surviving that blast, unless you have very carefully buffed up your party. Afterwards, Yaag will reveal to the others what he had been hiding. In truth, he was summoned by Spiritus and tricked into believing the monsters of this world was Materia's doing. But now that he's seen the warrior she chose to summon, he can't imagine she would jeopardize her own desires to give fallen warriors the respite they've earned. He no longer trusts the gods, either these new ones or his own back home. But he doesn't expect the party to trust him either. However, he offers them a single basic promise. So long as they wish to protect those that can't protect themselves, he is on their side. In closing, Yaag is, by all metrics, probably a bottom priority character from the 13 trilogy to appear in Dissidia, especially with its uncertain future. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if Chocolina, fucking Chocobo Monster Girl from 13-2 showed up before he does in the series. But, I don't know. I've always had a soft spot for the guy. He's a tragic case of a three-dimensional character trapped in a story that forces him into kind of a one-dimensional role. I believe that he would benefit from a second chance at life, and if he does show up in whatever the next Dissidia game happens to be, then maybe, just maybe, I won't be his only fan. So, like I said, I've been meaning to make this video for a while, and I just want to say that I know Dissidia isn't that popular of a game to talk about, but I like rambling about it. And maybe I'll make more Dissidia videos in the future in kind of the same vein as this one, going over different characters, how they would play, what their stories would be. That sounds fun. Anywho, I definitely won't make another video this year, so happy Thanksgiving for those of you who celebrate. Merry Christmas or whatever winter festival you're part of, and Happy New Year. Peace.